This is Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Mariam Namazi. This is the NewsHour live from London, coming up in the next 60 minutes. As a ceasefire holds in northern Syria and Russian troops roll in, the US president says sanctions against Turkey will be lifted. A grim discovery in southeast England. 39 people found dead in a container truck. The vehicle's driver has been arrested. Chilean police are accused of a heavy-handed response as anti-austerity protests continue.
I'm sure there are a lot of people who wish it were anyone but Facebook who were helping to propose this.
And Mark Zuckerberg faces more scrutiny over plans to launch a digital currency called the Libra.
And I'm Leah Harding with sports. The latest from Wednesday's Champions League games are coming up. Plus, the NBA season has started, but Chinese fans are not watching. A state broadcaster refuses to show games in an ongoing dispute over the Hong Kong protests.
Hello, welcome to the program. US President Donald Trump says Washington will lift sanctions imposed on Turkey over its offensive in northeast Syria. But Trump also says Ankara must honor its obligations to stop combat in the region. This comes after Russia and Turkey announced a deal to impose a new ceasefire along the Syrian border. Russian military police are now patrolling parts of northeast Syria as part of that deal. Turkey's offensive began after Washington's decision to withdraw US troops from Syria earlier this month. Ankara is saying it wants to create a safe zone to return Syrian refugees on its territory. Well, our White House correspondent Kimberly Halkett brings us more now from Washington.
U.S. President Donald Trump announcing that sanctions against Turkey lifted as a result of this hold in ceasefire that Turkey says will be permanent, despite some skepticism by the U.S. president about just how permanent it will be. He says that not only will sanctions be lifted, but he is promising that if Turkey misbehaves, new sanctions will be put in place, even tariffs on steel from Turkey into the United States. This withdrawal by the U.S. president being announced is something that is getting a lot of pushback in the U.S. Congress, however. Many concerned that the United States has abandoned Kurdish fighters that fought along the United States to defeat ISIL. There is also concern about a visit by the Turkish President Erdogan to the White House on November 13th. Still, the U.S. president pushing ahead with this withdrawal, saying that the fighting that has taken place is no longer the concern of the United States, and it is time for others to take up the action.
Turkey, Syria, and all forms of the Kurds have been fighting for centuries. We have done them a great service, and we've done a great job for all of them. And now we're getting out. Long time. We were supposed to be there for 30 days. That was almost 10 years ago. So we're there for 30 days. And now we're leaving. It was supposed to be a very quick hit, and let's get out. And it was a quick hit, except they stayed for almost 10 years. Let someone else fight over this long, blood-stained sand.
Despite widespread criticism of U.S. President Donald Trump's announcement that U.S. soldiers would be withdrawing from Syria at home and abroad, U.S. President Donald Trump pressing forward, saying it is now up to European allies, in particular, to take over where America has left off, particularly when it comes to detaining ISIL fighters, that the European partners need to repatriate them to home countries where they can face incarceration and also trial.
Well, in terms of the reaction from the Kurds so far, the chief of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces has reportedly thanked Moscow for its work to end the hostilities in northern Syria in a video conference with Russia's defense minister. Moscow says the leaders discussed the progress of the deal announced by Russia and Turkey on Tuesday. Russian officials told the SDF chief that they will increase the number of military police near the Syrian-Turkey border. Well, Osama bin Javed has more now from that region.
This area that President Trump calls long blood-stained sand is about the 800-kilometer-long border between Syria and Turkey. More than 500,000 people have been killed in the last 8 years, and the situation on the ground remains precarious. We've been hearing about 2 incidents which involved bombings and explosions in the Kurdish-held parts, and the Russians have warned the Kurds to make use of these 150 hours to vacate these areas 30 kilometers deep inside Syrian territory, or face the Turkish advances, as the Turks have agreed with the Russians that they will be coming in 10 kilometers deep into Syrian territory. All this is happening while the Syrian government is also taking an active role for the first time in 8 years along this border area. Syrian government with the Russians is going to be moving in to try and vacate areas from Manbij to Qamishli and make sure that these areas, according to its agreement with the Turks, are clear of Kurdish fighters. It is interesting to see the Syrian Democratic Forces coming out with the first response after this deal. General Mazloum has spoken to the US President Donald Trump, and he said that Trump has assured him that their partnership in Syria is not completely over. They will continue to work together. Although previously we've seen from the Syrian Democratic Forces statements after statements where they feel betrayed by the United States. This alludes to the areas near the Iraqi border in Deir ez-Zor province where oil facilities are located, and the US forces, according to the US President, are going to be there working with local partners to make sure that those oil facilities don't fall in the hands of others. So it is a situation worth monitoring, but at least for the next 6 days, that's 150 hours as agreed by the Russians and the Turks, the guns will be falling silent.
Well, here a murder investigation is underway after the bodies of 39 people were found in a container truck which had just arrived in the country. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson has pointed the finger at people traffickers. The discovery was made when the vehicle was parked in the town of Grays, east of London, from where Paul Brennan reports.
The circumstances of the grim discovery are still uncertain. Ambulance paramedics were the first to be called to the scene. The police won't reveal who it was who raised the alarm, but it was immediately obvious that the people inside this container lorry were beyond medical help.
Shortly before 1:40 a.m. today, we received reports that a number of people had been found inside a lorry's container at the Waterglade Industrial Park on Eastern Avenue in Grays. Emergency services attended, but sadly all 39 people inside the container had died.
Police now believe that the container travelled from Zeebrugge to Purfleet and docked in the Thurrock area shortly after 12:30 a.m. on Wednesday morning. But they also say that the tractor part of the truck is believed to have originated in Northern Ireland. In the British Parliament, the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition were united in shock and sorrow.
This is an unimaginable tragedy and truly heartbreaking. I know that the thoughts and prayers of all members are with those who lost their lives and their loved ones.
I do pay an enormous tribute to the emergency services who've gone to the scene to deal with it. All of us should just think for a moment what it's like to be a police officer or a firefighter, to open that container and have to remove 39 bodies from it and deal with them in an appropriate and humane way.
What unimaginable horror did the 39 victims endure? Refrigerated lorries are designed to be airtight. Did those 39 people suffocate in a claustrophobic and terrifyingly inevitable death? Or did they freeze to death in temperatures below minus 20 degrees Celsius? There are echoes of the 2015 tragedy in Austria, when 71 people suffocated to death in the back of an airtight lorry, which the people smugglers had simply abandoned in the August heat. The 25-year-old driver of this lorry has been arrested and is being questioned as a potential murder suspect. The truck itself has now been moved to a secure location at Tilbury Docks so the bodies can be removed forensically. But this investigation is only just beginning, and somehow, somewhere, the families of 39 people are going to have to be traced and told of their loved one's fate. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, Essex.
You're with Al Jazeera, live from London. Much more still ahead on the NewsHour. Former military chief Benny Gantz is given 28 days to form Israel's next government. After his success in the Middle East, Vladimir Putin turns Russia's attention towards the African continent. And then later in sport, Lionel Messi's been in action on a busy night in the UEFA Champions League. Leah will have those details. anti-government protests in Chile are being described as the worst to hit the country in nearly 30 years. At least 18 people have been killed in the past 2 weeks. A curfew and a state of emergency have been extended for a fifth night. The protest was sparked over anger at a hike in rail prices, but now protesters are saying they're fighting government oppression and a lack of opportunities. President Sebastián Piñera has apologized in an address to the nation and promised to tackle growing inequality. Well, Manny Rapolo joins us live now from Santiago, and tell us what's happening there. It looks as though the streets are quite calm at the moment.
That's right, Mariam. The curfew hasn't taken effect just yet, but the streets are starting to clear now. People leaving for their homes in anticipation of the military taking to the streets and arresting anybody that could be violating curfew. Now, we should mention, this is like a completely different world where we are right now compared to only a few kilometers away, where there are thousands of people, even more than we've seen in the previous days, still demonstrating, still protesting, and in cases still clashing with police and other law enforcement authorities in the Chilean capital. This has been one of the biggest points of anger for the demonstrators at this point, is that despite the majority of these protests being entirely peaceful, the response from authorities has been heavy-handed. It's been a violent crackdown that's left at least 18 people dead, more than 5,000 people detained, and over 100 people that have suffered injuries from firearms. So what we're hearing is condemnation and calls for accountability from the United Nations and other human rights groups that are saying that what this amounts to is a violation of human rights, a violation of people's right to protest. And a lot of the videos that we're seeing circulating from the previous nights during the curfew, once the sun sets and people are still out on the streets, are very troublesome. We can't confirm independently yet the validity of a lot of these videos, but what we're seeing is violence taking place even after the sun sets, people being dragged from their homes, from buildings, by police officers and by military personnel. So this is something that's being watched very carefully, and with more people protesting today, even more than we've seen in previous days, the expectation is that there will be more violence and there will be more arrests. Miriam?
Obviously, Manny, you're reporting to us from Santiago, but what are you hearing about how widespread the protests might be? Are they mainly concentrated in the capital, or are we seeing protests occur elsewhere in the country as well?
The majority of the protests are concentrated here in the Chilean capital, where there are even pockets of tension in different parts of the city. But the national the curfew has been extended to other parts of the country. There are protests taking place in Concepcion and in other cities in Chile. And again, the dynamics of these demonstrations have been changing. The demonstrations themselves have evolved. This began over protests against a hike in fare for the metro system, for public transportation, and since evolved into a whole slew of demands against the government, saying people are angry over worsening inequality, they're angry over the growing the lack of access for healthcare, the state of the education system. There's many things that people are angry about, but the biggest anger right now on the streets, again, has been the response from police. Throughout the course of the day, we've seen police using tear gas, using water cannons, smoke bombs, and there's accusations of police using live ammunition to disperse the protesters. So again, the big concern, not only in Santiago, but in other cities across Chile, is that there will be more violence and there will be more arrests made tonight, adding to the chaos that we've seen over the course of the last few days, and there's still no end in sight for the crisis. Miriam?
As you say, the police response appears to be inflaming the unrest there. For now, thank you very much from Santiago, Manny Rapolo. Meanwhile, Bolivia's opposition leader says that he has evidence that electoral fraud has been committed as part of Sunday's presidential vote. Carlos Mesa is calling for mass protests to continue unless a second round of voting is held. President Evo Morales needs to secure a 10-point lead to avoid a runoff vote in December. But 2 vote counts have been frozen and Bolivians are still waiting for a final result. Morales has denounced the opposition demonstrations as a coup and says he's confident he will soon be declared the winner. Now to Israel. The president there has given former military chief Benny Gantz 28 days to form a new government. It follows an inconclusive election last month, which saw Gantz's blue and white party neck and neck with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud. Well, Netanyahu was given the first opportunity to form a coalition, but he failed to achieve that earlier this week. Harry Fawcett has more from West Jerusalem.
For the first time in more than 10 years, Israelis watched a president give someone other than Benjamin Netanyahu the chance to form their government. Reuven Rivlin urged Benny Gantz and Israel's entire political class to get it done and avoid sending the country to the polls for the third time in less than a year.
The law gives you 28 days to form a government starting from tomorrow. This is a short time, and these are fateful days.
Gantz, a former army chief, has tried to present himself as a pragmatic centrist throughout his short political career. Now, at its most significant moment so far, there was no change of course.
I promised to form a liberal unity government, and that's what I intend to do. In this government, I will serve all Israeli citizens and will act in their interests. I will work to form the functioning government that Israel is in desperate need of, a government that will strengthen Israel.
A unity government means one composed of Gantz's Blue and White Party and the Likud of Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu blamed Gantz for frustrating his efforts to do the same thing ever since he was given the mandate last month. Now the roles are reversed, but the same obstructions bar the way. Blue and White says it won't sit in a unity government led by a man, Netanyahu, who's facing indictment in 3 separate corruption cases. Netanyahu is refusing to step down or to go second in a potential rotational prime minister deal. He's seen as having a better chance of fighting off those charges from the Prime Minister's office. And there's no reason yet for the stalemate to break. Another option for Gantz, a minority government with external support from members of the mainly Palestinian-Israeli joint list. That would be fraught with political risk, even if there was the will to give it a try. So far, Gantz isn't willing to do so. But Benny Gantz has another path, failure. In the upside down of Israeli politics, it could just lead to success. The longer he spends not forming a government, the closer Netanyahu gets to a possible triple corruption indictment, testing the loyalty of his party. If Gantz's mandate expires, a final 21-day scramble would ensue. All kinds of deals could then be on the table. If no deal gets done, then it would be election number 3 early next year. Harry Fawcett, Al Jazeera, West Jerusalem.
Now, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister has been fired after less than a year in the role. The royal decree was announced on Saudi state TV. Ibrahim bin Abdulaziz Al Asaf was only appointed to the job in December last year. He will be replaced by the kingdom's ambassador to Germany, Faisal bin Farhan. The Saudi Minister for Transport has also been replaced. One of the Pentagon's top policy officials for Ukraine is appearing before the impeachment inquiry into US President Donald Trump. Laura Cooper is likely to be questioned about the decision to freeze $391 million in security assistance to Ukraine. On Tuesday, the acting US ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, testified before 3 House committees. He said Trump made it a condition that Ukraine investigate his Democratic rival Joe Biden before he would release the money. Meanwhile, a lawyer for the US president is saying Donald Trump does not have to hand over his tax returns to state prosecutors because he is immune from criminal investigation. William Consovoy told a federal appeals court Trump has immunity until he leaves office. He said that would apply even if Trump shot someone on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Trump is fighting an earlier court ruling which rejected his attempt to block the release of 8 years of his tax returns. They're being sought by the Manhattan District Attorney as part of a criminal probe into Trump's family business. Now, Vladimir Putin's told African leaders he wants to more than double the amount that Russia trades with them as he welcomed them to a meeting at the Black Sea resort of Sochi. But economic ties are not the only thing on his agenda as he tries to exert more influence on a continent many Western nations have turned their back on. Russia is playing catch-up, though. China, Japan and the EU have all been meeting Africa for years. Last year, Russian exports to Africa hit $20 billion, whereas Chinese exports to the continent were $205 billion. So how does Moscow plan to boost its influence? Well, the first thing is debt. Putin announced that he will write off more than $160 million worth for Ethiopia as part of Russia's debt for development program. Mozambique, Madagascar and Tanzania have already benefited from that move. Russia is also increasing its defense relationships on the continent. Since 2014, military cooperation agreements have been signed with 19 African countries. Moscow is also offering nuclear power technology. Construction of the continent's first nuclear plant will begin in Egypt next year, funded by a Russian loan. Steph Varson has more now from the summit in Sochi.
The statue of Congolese independence leader Patrice Lumumba at this Moscow University is a reminder of the close relationship the Soviet Union built with African nations as they freed themselves from colonialism in the decades after World War II. Modern-day Russia is now trying to revive these times by inviting African students to its universities. In the past 8 years, their numbers have doubled to 17,000 with the help of scholarships.
First of all, it influences the language. Many people in our country now can speak Russian. It gives an opportunity to spread Russian language in African countries. For example, in our country, Equatorial Guinea. Education is very important to improve society.
While education and healthcare are still Russia's main focus in parts of Africa, President Vladimir Putin wants to expand its influence far beyond this.
Over 5 years, mutual trade between Russia and various African countries more than doubled to exceed $20 billion. Whether that is a lot or not, my colleague called it great numbers, but I cannot agree. I do not think it's enough. Be aware, dear ladies and gentlemen, $7.7 billion of that comes from trade with Egypt alone, which is about 40% of the total.
Compared to China, which has invested $200 billion in Africa, Russia's role is small. But it's working hard to change this and is now getting militarily, economically and politically involved in dozens of African countries.
Representatives from all over Africa have traveled to Sochi to revive an old friendship. After becoming a major power broker in the Middle East, President Putin has now set his eyes on Africa and is offering a different kind of relation than Western countries have had with the continent in the past.
At the Russia-Africa Forum, Putin spoke about a mutually beneficial relationship in contrast to former colonial rulers. But in Africa, some are wondering who will benefit most. Russian military experts have been training government troops in countries like Central African Republic and Sudan in exchange for access to minerals. Analysts have pointed out that Russia wants to counter Western influence on the continent.
The dark side maybe of Russian politics is that Russia is really investing in the, you would say, semi-authoritarian leaders because Russia sees them as stable central governments, and I think this is Russia's experience in the post-Soviet Union space, in the Middle East, and obviously in Africa too.
On the first day of this forum, 2 Russian aircraft capable of carrying nuclear bombs landed in South Africa in a show of cooperation between the two countries. Step Vassen, Al Jazeera, Sochi.
Well, Simadoda Fikeni is a policy and political analyst at the University of South Africa. He joins me live now from Pretoria. Do you think that Russia's efforts to re-establish a presence on the African continent are a good thing for its people?
Well, I do think that it will be a good thing only if African countries themselves do have their act together and they are very clear about what the partnership may achieve. But if Russia comes, like all other superpowers, and find African countries disorganized and having bilaterals as individual countries which are very small to exert influence, then surely it will benefit Russia more than it benefits those African countries.
Seems as though Russia is very focused on boosting trade ties, on debt relief, on arms sales, and they have said that more cooperation with Africa, I mean, it's very general, obviously we're talking about many different countries, but they've said that more cooperation within the continent will come without political or other interference. What's your reading of that?
Well, I do think that they are trying to come up with their own version, which is different from the Western countries, which normally have certain conditions, either economic or human rights conditions before they do trade or they give foreign aid. And this we have seen with China as well, to say we will not get involved in the internal affairs. And for some of the regimes, this suits them very well, especially where Russia will be trading on issues of ammunition or nuclear technology.
Will it benefit some African countries if they can strengthen a relationship with Moscow, perhaps at the expense of this, what some see as an increasing dependence on China?
it will benefit some African countries to diversify their sources of trade relations, their sources of financial support and technological transfer, precisely because once countries start being dependent on one, they have very little room for bargaining and maneuvering.
Do you see parallels here at all with Russia's ambitions in the Middle East, where we have seen the country fill a vacuum left by the United States, or is Africa less of a priority?
Africa actually is a growing priority because of its position, supplier of strategic minerals which are not generally available elsewhere, but also growing middle class and growing population which will double in the next 2 decades or so. That in itself, many countries are looking at Africa, but also if you look at other regions like the Middle East, whilst they have geostrategic importance, they are growing instabilities in those areas. Therefore, the volatility means that Russia has to explore other areas. And if you look at Western Europe, Brexit and many other developments, and you look at North America, the issue of Donald Trump factor, all those are forcing countries like Russia to look for alternative areas of relating in order to lessen the burden of isolation.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting to get your thoughts. Simadona Fikeni, policy and political analyst at University of South Africa, joining us there from Pretoria. Well, the leaders of Ethiopia and Egypt will meet on the sidelines of the Russia-Africa summit as well to try to break the deadlock over Ethiopia's building of a dam on the River Nile. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed had suggested that the controversy over the Grand Renaissance Dam project could lead to a war. Egypt's foreign ministry called his comments unacceptable. Well, nearly 250 million people rely on the Nile's waters, but Egypt and Sudan claim to have exclusive rights to its use and object to anything that might affect the river. Ethiopia began building the dam 8 years ago, and Egypt is worried it could affect its vital water source. It's using 20th century treaties by Britain to argue its case. Ethiopia rejects Egypt's claims over the Nile, accusing Cairo of maintaining a colonial-era grip over the Nile. Well, in other developments in Ethiopia, there have been violent protests after a high-profile activist claimed authorities were planning to assassinate him. Controversial media entrepreneur Jawar Mohammed, who is from the Oromo ethnic group, says his security detail was removed in the middle of the night. Robin Kriel has the story now from Addis Ababa.
In the city of Adama, that's about 100 kilometers southeast of Addis Ababa, security forces fought with protesters, resulting, according to local officials, in at least 2 deaths. In the city of Harar in the east, another death was reported. In Addis Ababa, at least 400 mostly ethnic Oromo young men gathered outside the house of controversial Oromo activist and media personality Jawar Mohammed. They told us they were here to protect him and also to protest against the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Jawar Mohammed has become a prominent media figure in Ethiopia in the past few years, but some have accused him of using his influential media platform to create division amongst Ethiopia's diverse ethnic groups. The Federal Police Commissioner, Endeshor Tasyu, denied reports that there were any attempts to remove Mohammed's security, saying, quote, "His message that the police were taking measures against him are false. Neither the government nor the police took any measure against him." Jawar Mohammed disputes this. He told Al Jazeera that the government gave him police protection because of concerns for his safety after he returned from exile last year. These remarks come just a day after Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed announced in Parliament that those who hold dual nationalities and own media networks should stop fomenting unrest. Now, Jawar Mohammed holds both Ethiopian and American citizenships. Mohammed also told Al Jazeera that he is seriously considering running in the next elections.
The first black leader of South Africa's largest opposition party has resigned. Mmusi Maimane announced he was stepping down as head of the Democratic Alliance after 4 years in the role. He says he faced difficulties making the historically white Liberal Party appeal to majority black voters. It's the party's second resignation of a senior black politician in 3 days. Johannesburg Mayor Herman Mashaba quit on Monday. 10 people, including 4 children, are now reported to have died after heavy rains and flooding in Egypt. The capital, Cairo, has been badly affected, with roads submerged and large numbers of people staying away from work. The Interior Ministry says 3 of the deaths were due to electrocution, while 2 people died while falling from the roofs of their homes. More rain is forecast for the coming days. You're with the NewsHour live from London. Much more to bring you still. Unconvinced by offers of economic reform, Lebanon's protesters continue their fight for complete political change. Pakistan's opposition vows to paralyze the capital with protests this weekend in a bid to oust the government there. And then in sport, the oldest golf club in the world finally gets round to installing a women's changing room.
Hello once again. We've still got some lovely weather across much of Eastern Europe, but either side of the Mediterranean we're seeing some rather lively storms. Latest crop of storms just pushing up into that eastern side of the Med, heading up towards Cyprus, just around the Levant countries. Had caused some flooding in Cairo. Other side of the Med, we still have this slow-moving area of low pressure, now making its way away from that northeastern corner of Spain, southern parts of France, gradually makes its way across Sardinia and Corsica, and will bring some very heavy rain, the possibility of some flooding coming into parts of Italy as we go on through the next couple of days, along with the islands here as well, of course. Rather wet and windy too, up towards the northwest. Eastern parts looking fine and dry. But as I said, we've got some very stormy weather into that eastern side of the Mediterranean, and that will continue to be the case as we go on into Friday. Further north, the sunshine continues, staying settled and sunny. More wet weather piling into the northwestern corner of Europe, feeling very autumnal here. Northwestern parts of Africa has also seen some bits of cloud and rain as a result of that storm in the Western Med. It's making its way further eastwards. Northern parts of Libya could see some wet weather. Notice that cloud and rain still in place into the far northeast of Egypt over the next couple of days. Further flooding to come.
Welcome back. The headlines now. US President Donald Trump says Washington will lift sanctions imposed on Turkey over its offensive in northeast Syria. This comes after Russia now patrols parts of the region in a deal with Turkey to impose a new ceasefire along the border. A murder investigation is underway in the UK after the bodies of 39 people were found in a container truck which had just arrived in the country. Police say they believe the truck originated from Bulgaria and came into Britain through the port of Holyhead. Police in Chile are being accused of a heavy-handed response to anti-government protests which have gripped the country over the past 2 weeks. At least 18 people have been killed in the violence. A curfew and a state of emergency have been imposed. So we go to political developments in Lebanon now. The President Michel Aoun is due to address the nation at noon on Thursday. Since anti-government protests began last week, the northern city of Tripoli has seen a huge turnout every night. Traditionally a support base for the Prime Minister, now the people of the city and across the country are united against their leaders. Stephanie Decker is there.
For a week now, thousands have come out into the square in Tripoli to join the chorus of voices across the country calling for their government to go. As all eyes were on Beirut a few nights ago, this video posted online went viral, dance music played to a jubilant crowd. Many first thought this was Beirut, when it was actually here in Tripoli, the city many see as far more conservative.
I didn't plan for this. I was like all the people. I was going to protest like all the people.
We met up with the man behind the music. He says he played it spontaneously and didn't expect this kind of a reaction.
All the people, they all love each other. Sunni, Durzi, Masihi, Christian, everything. Everyone is here because there is no one on top of them.
The protests have mobilized the youth here, a leaderless grassroots movement that has inspired many.
It was like a domino effect among the youth in Tripoli.
Sally says the protests have given her renewed hope. I ask her whether she thinks there are challenges ahead.
It's going to be difficult. We are scared and we are aware that we are going to a bit of a chaotic period after this. But when you're aware, it means you're ready. And when you're ready, this is the first step of succeeding. When you're scared, you either do two things. You either withdraw, or this gives you perseverance to continue. Especially when you got strong out of many disappointments.
Tripoli is traditionally a support base for the Prime Minister Saad Hariri, but the Sunni majority city has been neglected. It has some of the poorest areas in the country.
We are defending the rights of our children and the rights of all citizens to live in a clean environment. We're asking all those in power to resign and be held accountable financially. All of them. We will stay here until our demands are met.
The protesters come from a cross-section of society, and that is what everyone is telling us is so important in a city that's been stigmatized due to a past spillover of the Syrian war. When gun battles were fought out in the streets, the people have come together against the ruling elite. They also want to change the sectarian system, which they accuse politicians of exploiting in order to keep people divided. But there seems to be a stalemate now. The government isn't standing down. The people aren't leaving. There are unpredictable times ahead. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera, Tripoli.
Security forces in Pakistan are blocking roads to the capital to try to stop anti-government protests they say could turn violent. The so-called independence protest is calling on Prime Minister Imran Khan to resign and for new elections to be held. It's led by a conservative political party, but has won support from other opposition groups as well, as Kamal Haider now explains from Islamabad.
If you're traveling from the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province on the Grand Trunk Road, you'll be coming down this way, crossing the Indus and then crossing into the Punjab province. The opposition parties are going to be marching from all the provinces and converging on Islamabad. The provincial governments in the Punjab and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa are also led by the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, that is the party in power in Islamabad. Of course, elaborate arrangements are being made to block these access roads. The chief ministers of the provinces have been told to stop the protesters at all costs. Pakistan, it seems, is heading for another round of political instability. The leader of the Jamiyat-e-Ulama-Islam, Maulana Fazlur Rahman, who lost in the last election, says that those elections were rigged, and now he has mustered the support of major political opposition parties like the Pakistan People's Party, led by Asif Ali Zardari and his son Bilawal Bhutto, Nawaz Sharif. Both those leaders, of course, are in jail right now. Their party workers will be trying to muster as much strength as they can to bring Islamabad to a virtual state of lockdown. The government, on the other hand, is making elaborate preparations, digging trenches and blocking main access roads with large containers. The cranes are on standby. They will just lift these containers and seal these roads. All eyes, of course, will now be on the opposition parties, whether they are able to muster the kind of support that they expect to muster. Their demands, of course, that the Prime Minister Imran Khan should resign. They've already accused his government of being involved in rigging of the elections which brought them into power. It is going to be a major test for the opposition parties. If they fail to muster the support of the people, it will mean that their political future is going to be uncertain. But this is also going to be a huge challenge for Imran Khan's government, which has not yet completed 2 years in power. The teachers are protesting, the doctors are on strike, and people are complaining that they are not able to cope with rising inflation. The Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf had promised to bring people out of poverty. But the people here say that the situation has become worse. Of course, the government will say that this is because of previous governments who have been borrowing heavily. But what the people want is relief and nothing short of that.
Now, European Union ambassadors have been meeting in Brussels to discuss whether to grant the UK another Brexit extension. They're considering a 3-month delay, with the UK permitted to leave sooner if it can pass the necessary legislation. But Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he'll call a general election before Christmas if the UK is granted such a long extension. France is pushing for a shorter time frame, though, of just days or weeks. Officials are due to meet again on Friday. Now, the CEO of social media giant Facebook has appeared before a US congressional committee to defend the upcoming launch of a digital currency. Mark Zuckerberg says the new Libra cryptocurrency will be a force for good. But there are fears it could disrupt the global financial system, threaten users' privacy and facilitate money laundering. Shihab Ratansi reports.
Mark Zuckerberg came to Capitol Hill with one fundamental message. I know we're the subject of multiple investigations and lawsuits, but trust me.
I get that I'm not the ideal messenger for this right now. We faced a lot of issues over the past few years, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who wish it were anyone but Facebook who were helping to propose this.
That idea is the creation of a global, privately run currency, Libra. Zuckerberg says it will help the billion people around the world without a bank account, the poor. With Libra, they'll be able to send money to others as easy as sending a text message.
And I feel blessed to be in a position where we can make a difference in people's lives.
But he also issued a warning. If we don't do it, China will. Members of Congress were skeptical, though.
But for the richest man in the world to come here and hide behind the poorest people in the world and say that's who you're really trying to help.
Members of Congress pointed to Facebook's long history of abusing its access to the data it already possesses from its social media platforms. If the company also potentially controlled the financial transactions of its 2.7 billion customers, that too would be exploited, they argued. Zuckerberg insisted that data from its cryptocurrency project wouldn't be merged with the data it already uses for profit. Concerns have been raised about the implications of an international currency in a global financial system that's already unstable even with national currencies and regulation. Libra would be decentralized and surely open to potentially devastating currency speculation and its use by criminals and terrorists, some argue. Zuckerberg was also asked about Facebook in general, all the allegations of misconduct that are being investigated by multiple authorities around the US, from an advertising platform that's allowed companies to discriminate against minorities to turning a blind eye to election interference. It was clear that this was a hard sell. In fact, the committee chairwoman said that just by suggesting Facebook move into finance, it was yet another argument that the company was too big.
Each month, 2.7 billion people use your products. That's over a third of the world's population. That's huge. That's so big that it's clear to me and to anyone who hears this list that perhaps you believe that you're above the law. You have opened up a serious discussion about whether Facebook should be broken up.
Zuckerberg insisted that Libra would not be launched unless financial regulators were satisfied it would not be a source of instability. But his message that his only concern is a level financial playing field was met with skepticism here. Shihab Ratansi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
So let's take a closer look at Libra then. It's a digital currency being developed by Facebook, which would allow users to buy products and transfer money for nearly no fees. Unlike Bitcoin, Libra's value will be tied to national currencies and subject to supply and demand. Facebook says it would not fully control the currency, but have just one vote in the Libra Association. Originally, the Libra Association had 28 founding members, but now, as we've been reporting, 7 major players have left the project, including PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, Stripe, and eBay. Joining me now is Glenn Goodman, author of The Crypto Trader. So it was quite the grilling that Mark Zuckerberg had today in front of congressional lawmakers. Did he really have any hope of winning them over on this?
I don't think so. I got the distinct impression from listening to most of them, though there were a few sympathetic Republicans, but as you would expect, because he's a corporation, he runs a corporation and they like corporations. But the vast majority were really, really not in his corner at all and out to get him in any way they could. And what was really interesting, actually, there was a representative called Carolyn Maloney, and she said, will you assure us that you will satisfy all of the financial regulators' concerns before you set up Libra? And he said, yeah, absolutely, all their concerns. And she said, do you know how many financial regulators there are? And she started reeling them off. There was the Federal Reserve, the CFTC, the OCC, the SEC, the FHFA, FinCEN.
We get the idea.
Yeah,
they're going to make him... So they're going to make this impossible for him?
Yeah, pretty much.
Mark Zuckerberg seemed to suggest in that testimony that the opposition to Libra was pretty much based on purely suspicion of Facebook's involvement alone, and that actually the world needs a currency like this.
Yes, and he had a good point. And the main thing he did to try and scare them, though it is a valid point, he didn't just do it to scare them, was to bring up the spectre of China, to say as soon as he came up with the Libra project, we know for a fact that China started speeding up its own plans to make its own digital currency. Now, this is extremely dangerous for the US because at the moment, for example, with regard to sanctions, the US is able to impose sanctions on Iran because most of the world's trade is carried out in dollars. And that means that if any country wants to buck those sanctions, then the US says, right, you can't have access to our banking system. We're going to make it difficult for you to use dollars. You know, that's a lot of power they've got there. And if China is able to get around all of that with its own digital currency that it then uses to trade with its African partners and its Middle Eastern partners, before you know it, the US won't have the global power that it had before. I think he made a really valid point in bringing that up.
And given that US-China trade is one of the biggest global issues right now and is putting the global economy in danger of what could be an impending recession, are you surprised that that message didn't at all seem to resonate with Congress?
I think they're really hung up on worries about Facebook's trustworthiness, which is understandable considering the history it's had in recent years with political ads that targeted specific kinds of people, and some felt subverted the US political process, and they work in politics, so that's at the forefront of their minds, and they kept taking the subject back to that and grilling him about that all of the time. And fundamentally, they were asking him, we clearly, most of us don't trust Facebook, they were saying. So how do you expect all the world's people to trust Facebook to manage a currency, a global currency, perhaps one that could even take over from the dollar? And he was saying, look, I wouldn't be managing it. That's why he's got all these 28 companies, well, now 20 companies, because obviously some have pulled out. But, still he's saying it's them, it's up to them. Facebook would kind of be hands off. And it's hard to know whether to trust him or not, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yeah, one political headache after another for Facebook, isn't it?
Yeah.
Glenn Goodman, thank you very much.
No problem.
Still ahead on the programme. Roger Federer continues his bid for a 10th title at the Swiss indoors in Bâle. Leah will have more on that in a bit. Time now for all the sport with Leah in Doha.
Thank you, Miriam. China's state TV channels refused to show the opening games of the NBA basketball season because of the ongoing row over a tweet supporting the Hong Kong protests. The media blackout shows just how vulnerable the NBA's broadcast and sponsorship deals are in China. Florence Louis has more from Beijing.
State broadcaster CCTV, which holds exclusive rights to air NBA games, did not broadcast this season's opening matches on Wednesday. And when we checked its sports schedule for the weekend, no games were listed. Earlier this month, CCTV had said it was reviewing its relationship with NBA after the general manager for the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, tweeted in support of anti-government protests in Hong Kong. And even though Morey deleted his tweet and said it did not represent the NBA's views or his team's views, his action had angered not just the Chinese government, but also fans and business partners of the Rockets, who had severed or suspended ties with the NBA. But basketball fans were still able to catch one of the two matches live on Chinese digital platform Tencent, which holds the right to live stream the NBA games. Now, some people, however, were not in favor of Tencent's decision, calling for a boycott of the NBA, and some even branding Tencent a traitor. But the company said at least 20 million people tuned in to watch, proving that basketball hasn't lost its appeal.
Roger Federer had a stellar win on home soil in the Basel Swiss indoors. The Swiss himself blew 49th seed Radu Albert away. Top-seeded Federer had to save 2 break points in the first set on his way to sweeping the first 8 games of the match. He moves on to the quarterfinals with this 6-0, 6-3 win. He's aiming for his 10th title at this event. Another busy night in the UEFA Champions League as the holders Liverpool took a big step into the last 16. They beat Genk to record their first away win in the group stages for 2 years. 2 goals from Alex Oxlade-Chamberlain helping them to a 4-1 victory. Meanwhile, Lionel Messi scored his 113th goal in Champions League football, his Barcelona team beating Slavia Prague 2-1. And in Wednesday's other matches, Napoli beat Salzburg 3-2. In Milan, Inter beat Dortmund 2-0 to record their first win in this season's competition. And great win for Chelsea at Ajax, a result that leaves them second in Group H. Well, La Liga is considering legal action after the El Clasico match between Barcelona and Real Madrid was moved. It was postponed because of protests in Barcelona after 9 Catalan political leaders were jailed. It was supposed to be played this Saturday, but is now a weekday fixture on December 18th. Spain's Football Federation made the change, but La Liga is worried they'll lose TV revenue by holding it midweek, at a time when the Club World Cup is also being played. Spain's women's footballers have voted to go on strike in a dispute over pay and part-time contracts. 200 players from 16 clubs, including Atletico Madrid and Barcelona, made the decision to strike after more than a year of failed negotiations. It's thought players could walk out as early as November 16th. Well, they're demanding that their minimum salary be increased to $22,000 a year. 93% of the players support this strike. And the Spanish Women's League is one of the world's biggest. In March, a record crowd of over 60,000 turned out to watch Barcelona play Atletico. Colombia's men's footballers are striking too on November 3rd over working conditions. On Saturday, some teams protested by sitting on the ground or slowly kicking the ball between them. They want fewer games, a collective health plan, and a new disciplinary code. Argentinian club River Plate are through to the Copa Libertadores final on aggregate, despite losing Tuesday's semifinal second leg to Boca Juniors. These were the scenes in Buenos Aires as the team returned home. It's in stark contrast to last year when River Plate fans attacked the team bus of Boca ahead of the final. This year, River will face either Flamengo or Gremio in next month's South American showpiece. In a few hours, the Houston Astros will host the Washington Nationals in Game 2 of baseball's World Series. 20-year-old Juan Soto starred for Washington in Game 1 as they took a 1-0 lead in the best-of-7 series. Peter Semmett reports.
Two teams with very different histories. The Nationals looking for their first ever World Series title, the Astros aiming for a second championship in 3 seasons. When Juan Soto was struck out by Garrett Cole, he had no idea what impact he was still to have on this game. Houston were 2-0 up early on and looking good on home soil at Minute Maid Park.
Dealt with plantar fascia.
But then this solo home run from Ryan Zimmerman brought the Nationals back into the game. And then it was Soto's turn to shine.
Clean up in a World Series.
First, the 20-year-old hit the home run to level the scores.
Wow.
And then he hit a 2-run double as the Nationals opened up an unassailable 5-2 lead. Not bad for a man 3 days shy of his 21st birthday.
Everybody was a little bit down, but after that homer, everybody think we got a chance. After we hit the homer against a guy like that, everybody think we got a chance now. He's been doing really well, but he make a mistake, so he's gonna make it again, and we're gonna get it again.
Cricket and Bangladesh's players have called off their strike with immediate effect. A player revolt led by Test captain Shakib Al Hasan had threatened an upcoming tour of India beginning in November. The players had a list of 11 demands, including an increase in salaries for domestic cricketers. The players say all their demands have now been met. Back in 2014, the oldest golf club in the world, the Royal and Ancient in Scotland, finally allowed women to become members after 275 years. 5 years after that decision, the club has now decided to install a women's locker room for the first time. The club based in St. Andrews describes itself as a mixed-sex golf club. However, up until now, women had to walk 10 minutes up the road to a different location if they wanted to change or have a shower. And now to the Rugby World Cup, where Wales have been given some royal support for their semi-final against South Africa. The Prince of Wales visited their training camp in Tokyo. Prince Charles is in the country for the enrollment of the new Japanese Emperor Naruhito. He spent time chatting to the players and was given a Wales shirt by Captain Alan Wynne-Jones. Wales are aiming to win the World Cup for the first time. That's it for me. Hand you back to Miriam in London.
Thank you, Leah. Well, that wraps up the NewsHour, but I'll be back with another bulletin very shortly. Don't go anywhere. See you very shortly.